Manuel Pastor is a professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. Dr. Manuel Pastor is, as I just said, professor, and he also serves as the director of USC's Program for Environmental and Regional Equity and co-director of USC's Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. His research has focused on the economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities in the U.S., and he's also conducted research on Latin American economic conditions. He's published in numerous journals, and his most recent book is Just Growth, Inclusion and Prosperity in America's Metropolitan Regions, and it's received wide acclaim for its innovative blend of quantitative methods and case studies to tease out the complex relationship between economic growth and equity. Please welcome Professor Manuel Pastor.
Thank you, and I'm glad to be in this place filled with great ideas, and then looking at the place over there where good ideas go to die. And certainly many of us are concerned about the political situation. There's one bright spot. I've heard that Dr. Ben Carson is actually now going to team up with Donald Trump to form a single ticket and campaign on a platform they deeply believe in, a suspicion of Mexican Muslim providers of women's health care. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Before I do want to let you know that my voice might tire out or sound a little bit husky. It's not that I'm trying to imitate an FM disc jockey. It's that I have a speech condition called spasmodic dysphonia. Diane Rehm has it on NPR. And like her, mine gets treated once a month with Botox, which is how we treat everything in Los Angeles. And it makes your voice a little bit husky. So it is true that we are facing big demographic changes, as was just talked about, and that by about the year 2043, 2044, it's a so-called majority-minority country. Most significantly, though, the majority of the workforce will be people of color by about 2031, 2032. The majority of youth will be people of color by the end of this decade. And when people see this demographic change, they tend to think about it in some old ways. One of the old ways in which they think about it is that it's mostly being driven by immigration. That is no longer true. Immigration into the country has stabilized. There's now more immigrants coming in from Asia than coming in from Latin America. Net migration from Mexico is negative. There's more Mexicans returning to Mexico than coming to the United States. In fact, if we build a wall at the border, it will keep Mexicans here. And in fact, despite the political rhetoric, the undocumented population has been declining for the last 3 or 4 years. And now, about 60% of the undocumented residents in the United States have been here for longer than 10 years. So what's really driving this change is not immigrants, but the births to immigrants. So this shows you that in the decade between 2000 and 2010, the number of young whites actually fell by 4.3 million. By the way, that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. Trump would be campaigning on it as a sort of Obama scheme to reduce white people. What it means is that there's more people moving into 19 and 20 than into 1 and 2. Where is the growth occurring? 4.8 million new young Latinos, about 800,000 new Asian Pacific Islanders. So this is a youth change. And the other really important thing about this is that when people see this change, and in particular the change between 2000 and about 2040, where we go from about 69% non-Hispanic white to about 50% non-Hispanic white, what they imagine is that, as in the past, this is actually all going to occur in California, right? And that sort of makes sense because that demographic change between 2000 and 2050 is basically the demographic change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. But here's the news, folks. while you might think that by the year 2050 that California is going to become 150% Latino, that is, that there'll be super Chicanos marching the earth going, La Reconquista Islámica, we are back. That's not what's going on. The demographic change in California is tapering off. The only large metropolitan area in the United States in the last 10 years that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children is Los Angeles, because it's an older population, more homegrown. Its fertility rates are getting closer to the United States. In fact, what's happening to this change is occurring in the rest of the United States. I'll jump over this. So this is a map that we've done with PolicyLink, looking at the percent people of color by county in the United States. Easy map to interpret. The browner the county, the browner the county. So in 1980, the United States looked like what a lot of people still think it looks like, the Black Belt of the South going to D.C., Hispanic and Native American areas in New Mexico, Arizona, Native Americans in the Dakotas. And note that in 1980, in California, only one county, Imperial County, was majority people of color, immediately adjoining the border. By the year 2010, there's been huge demographic change, but most of it you can see happen in California. But look at what happens as we move forward. 2020, 2030, 2040. So much like was being pointed out to before about Georgia becoming majority people of color before the rest of the country, another place you wouldn't expect becoming majority people of color before the rest of the country is Salt Lake City, which is pretty amazing, because when you think of Salt Lake City, you might think of it like I think of it, not just white, but sort of super white, right? Sort of shining Mormon Mitt Romney white, right? So, and that was Salt Lake City Metro in 1970 or 1980, but lots of demographic change that's going on there as well. So this is demographic change, but it's occurring all over. The other big demographic change important for people looking at urban America is to realize what's happening in our suburbs. So this shows you the distribution of whites in the largest 50 metropolitan areas, with the gray bars being the central city, the red being the inner ring suburbs, and the blue being the outer suburbs. What you'll note is that there's a sort of slight decline in the share of whites living in the central city, which is now beginning to uptick. There's big decline in the inner ring suburbs, but basically the sort of distribution of population geographically for whites has been pretty stable. Look at this for people of color. Sharp decline in terms of the share of people of color living in the central city. Big growth in the suburbs, both the inner ring suburbs and the outer ring suburbs. That's where the diversity is occurring geographically, and this is significant because most of us who've thought about issues facing people of color think inner city, think central city, think urban, but we need to begin to think suburban as well, because those suburban areas lack the social services infrastructure, the civic infrastructure, and the community organizing infrastructure that puts the issues of people of color on the table. When Ferguson happened, most of you thought, I'm sure, and I did too, about police brutality. But my second thought was that's a classic inner ring suburb which has been starved of resources, and so its police department began to prey on its own people in order to restore its fiscal coffers. So this suburbanization is very important. You can see it geographically in a place like Los Angeles County. This is LA County in 1980. This is just the share of Latinos who were mostly at that point on the east side. This is 2010. Latinos are everywhere, including in the San Fernando Valley, which means that the very famous Valley Girl has become La Muchacha del Valle. And you can see this even more dramatically in Seattle with people of color. In 1980, people of color in Seattle significantly concentrated in the central city. 2010, the central city is actually whiter, and the suburbs, the southern suburbs, are where African Americans have been chased out because of high housing prices. African immigrants and Mexican immigrants and Asian immigrants are following them there. So we need a suburban strategy, and we need a suburban strategy in particular because of the issues that got mentioned. One of the sort of tailwinds, that's an economic tailwind, is the comeback of our cities. And so many of us are so proud of the fact that our cities are coming back, but that comeback is forcing out a lot of long-term residents because of the increases in rents, the increases in housing prices. The civil rights issue for the next decade is going to be gentrification and trying to make sure that communities that stuck it out in cities are able to actually achieve the benefits as those cities begin to come back. So a couple of other aspects of this in the 5 minutes I think I have left. One is that we also do need to be thinking about this in terms of the generation gap. This shows you the median age by race and ethnicity in the United States. The median age, 2010, for non-Hispanic whites, 42 years. The median age, half older, half younger, for Asian Pacific Islanders, 35. For African Americans, 32. It's about the same for Native Americans. For Latinos, 27. 42, 27, 15 years, that's a generation gap. And it helps to explain two things. One is it helps to explain the demographic change, because when you're 27, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 42, you think you're in prime family formation age. You may well be, go for it. But it also helps to explain our politics, because we got an older generation looking at a younger generation and not seeing itself in that younger generation. The Trump coalition is about defending the social safety net for older whites and starving the educational infrastructure needed for the upcoming generation. Make no mistake about the fact that the KKK is enthusiastic about Trump. I guess this is being streamed. Hi, yes, I'm saying this. Is reflective, this dog whistle has become a scream. And that scream is partly a generational conflict as well. And that generational conflict plays out. The state in the United States that's got the largest generation gap is Arizona, a place that's had fractious politics around immigration and ethnic studies in the school, but has also had the third largest cuts in the last 5 years in K through 12 spending per capita. An older generation not seeing itself in a younger generation. This is something that, again, we've been working on with PolicyLink, and I'll just jump over this map, which is a cool map, but it takes too long to explain. So the other thing that's been going on, of course, is that inequality is on the rise in the United States. We see the 1% sort of moving away from the rest. But even below the 1%, we see some really significant shifts in income distribution that are occurring for people who are at the 80th and 90th percentile of the income distribution versus those who are at the 10th and 20th percentile. What's happening for the top 1% is the runaway wealth of those at the top. But for those below that, there's also income inequality because of changing returns to education. What that's meant is very stalled racial progress. If you look at the ratio of black to white household family income, you can see only two periods in which that gap closes. One is the civil rights period, and then the boom of the economy in the 1960s, and the second is the Clinton era. But since then, progress has been stalled. And it's going to be problematic moving forward. This looks at jobs that only require a high school degree compared to population with the same level. In 2020, about a third of the jobs are going to require no more than a high school degree. That's about the ratio for whites. But African Americans and Latinos will overcrowd into those jobs because they're the folks who very much lack a high school degree. If you look at jobs that are going to require a BA, again, the profile is about exactly what it is for the white educational profile, but African Americans and Latinos very undereducated relative to those jobs of the future. This is a recipe for continuing inequality going forward. It is a reason why education was the big word that popped up on that word cloud in order to deal with this sort of baked-in inequality. And this is incredibly important to get at now because as we move forward into the future, and this is, I think, an argument we need to be making, what used to be the case in the United States is that we had what's called an age pyramid, and you can see it. Lots of young people less people in the middle, and then as you get to older ages, something happens. But as you can see, we've moved from an age pyramid in 1950 to an age cylinder by the year 2060. Why? Less young people being born, less immigrants filling in the middle, more old people surviving. What that means is that dealing with this educational inequality, dealing with this next generation's fortune is incredibly important, not just for those of us who are caring about racial justice and equity, but for the very productivity and stability of the American economy. And I want to just conclude with a note of optimism. It is very easy when you see those statistics and when you look at that building and when you listen to the debate in Detroit to be pessimistic. But I want us to remember something which is very important, which is that this next generation, despite the fact that we've underinvested in them, remains pretty optimistic about what it can do. And it is the generation who included undocumented youth who called themselves dreamers and forced a change in the president's policy so at least some section of them can be free from the threat of deportation. This is a generation that, looking at the issues of police brutality, started the Black Lives Matter hashtag and movement and have really gone from sort of simply protesting in social media and protesting maybe without a plan to what looks like a real emerging strategy to try to change things. And this is a generation that just this morning did something very, very interesting if you're following this, which is that Kendrick Lamar this morning put out a new album called Untitled and Unmastered, which is basically throwing the mic down on the Grammys and saying, even the stuff I didn't title is better than the stuff you gave an award to, right? This is a generation that is ready to change America, and we, those of us who are an older generation, need to be providing the analytical support, the data support, the research support, and those of us who are academics at a university need to realize that our data and our analysis needs to be useful in these critical times to forward the principles of equity and justice. Thank you.